Why thousands of train cars were dumped into the ocean. Version 2, target 18 minutes at 240 words per minute, approximately 4,350 words. On an August morning in 2001, a barge sat anchored 16 miles off the coast of Delaware, loaded with something barges are not supposed to carry: New York City subway cars. Dozens of them, red paint faded by 40 years of service, windows gone, doors gone, stacked like toys on the deck. And then, one by one, a crane shoved them over the side. 50 feet of steel tipping, hanging for a heartbeat, and crashing into the Atlantic, throwing up a geyser of spray before sinking 80 feet to the sand. Anyone watching without context would have assumed they were witnessing a crime, the ocean being used as a landfill in broad daylight, with government officials standing by and approving. But those officials weren't just approving. They had asked for this. Over the following decade, close to 3,000 retired train cars went over the side of barges from New Jersey to Georgia, on purpose, with environmental agencies cheering. This is the story of why dumping trains into the ocean turned out to be one of the best ideas the ocean ever received, and why, when they tried to repeat it, the sea said no. Start with the trains themselves, because these were not anonymous machines. The Redbirds were New York icons, subway cars built at the turn of the 1960s, painted a deep crimson, and run mercilessly for 4 decades through the tunnels of the greatest transit system in America. They carried generations of New Yorkers, survived the graffiti era, the fiscal crisis, and roughly 1 billion rush hours, and they even owed their famous color to a war. Because here's a detail most people outside New York never learn. The Redbirds weren't always red. For most of their early lives, they wore drab factory schemes, and by the 1970s, they were rolling canvases, buried under layer after layer of spray paint in the graffiti era, when the subway became the most photographed crime scene in America. The deep crimson came in the mid-1980s, when the Transit Authority began repainting the fleet in a red so dark and so easy to retouch that graffiti could be painted over almost as fast as it appeared. The red was armor. It became an identity. New Yorkers watched those red trains rattle across the elevated line to Flushing, packed with commuters heading to Queens, to Shea Stadium, to the last stop by the bay, for another 2 decades. By the start of the 2000s, they were simply worn out, replaced by a new generation of gleaming modern cars. So when the retirement finally came, this wasn't just fleet management. It was the end of a machine that people had photographs of themselves standing inside at every age of their lives. A photographer named Stephen Mallon understood that better than anyone. He spent years documenting the disposal program, riding along as the barges went out, and his images of 50-foot subway cars frozen in mid-fall between deck and ocean became a celebrated exhibition, because everyone who saw them felt the same double reaction you're probably feeling right now. That's beautiful. Wait, is that allowed? Which left the Transit Authority with a very unglamorous problem. What do you do with more than 1,000 50-foot steel boxes nobody wants? Scrapping a subway car is not free. It has to be dismantled, and these cars carried materials from another regulatory era, including asbestos bonded into some components, which makes demolition slow, controlled, and expensive. Multiply that by a fleet, and disposal becomes a budget line with a lot of zeros. And while the accountants stared at that problem, marine biologists 200 miles south were staring at the opposite one. Off the mid-Atlantic coast, the seafloor is, for vast stretches, a featureless desert of bare sand. Almost nothing to grip, almost nowhere to hide, and therefore, almost nobody home. Marine life in these waters is starved of one thing above all: hard structure. Give the ocean a hard surface, and life will colonize it with shocking speed. That is why every shipwreck becomes a city. The biologists had been building artificial reefs for years out of whatever they could get: sunken barges, concrete, military surplus. What they dreamed of was a supply of large, heavy, durable steel boxes full of openings. Somewhere in a meeting that deserves its own plaque, the two problems met. New York had 1,000 unwanted steel boxes. Delaware wanted 1,000 steel boxes. Hold on to the strangeness of that handshake, because whether this was genius or garbage disposal dressed up as ecology became a genuine fight, and we'll get there. First, the mechanics, because you cannot just push a subway car into the sea. Each car was stripped to a skeleton. Seats out, doors out, windows out, wiring pulled, wheels and undercarriage gear removed, every fluid, every grease, every contaminant cleaned out under federal preparation guidance, until what remained was essentially a bare steel shell with window holes, open doors, and decades of structural strength. Then the shells were loaded onto barges, hauled down the coast, and deployed in batches, pushed overboard in groups of around 30 at a time. There was no placing, no lowering on cables. The cars fell, sank, and landed however physics decided. Upright, tilted, nose down in the sand, sometimes one car crashing down onto the end of another. The reef managers didn't mind. Chaos makes better habitat than order. The most famous of these sites sits 16 miles off Delaware, 80 feet down, and its name tells you exactly what it's made of: Redbird Reef. 714 subway cars rest there, spread across more than a square mile of seafloor, and they have company because reef builders never waste barge space. 86 decommissioned military tanks, 8 tugboats and barges, and 3,000 tons of ballasted truck tires share the sand with them. An underwater train yard, guarded by armor, on the bottom of the Atlantic. If you're enjoying this hidden story from the strangest corner of railroading, hit subscribe. We dig into the machines, the physics, and the unexpected afterlives of trains every week. So what happened down there? Exactly what the biologists predicted, and then more. The colonization sequence is a textbook of ocean opportunism. First come the encrusting pioneers: mussels, barnacles, sponges, soft growth carpeting the steel within months, transforming smooth walls into textured, food-covered surface. That living crust is a buffet, and the buffet summons customers. Tautog, black sea bass, scup, flounder in the sand between the cars, and above them, the fast predators, bluefish and striped bass, hunting through the window openings where commuters once read newspapers. Delaware's reef program measured the transformation, and the number they published is the kind you have to read twice. The invertebrate communities on the reef structures can provide up to 400 times more food for fish per square foot than the bare sand beside them. 400 times. Not an improvement, a different universe, a desert converted into an oasis with a footprint you can see on a fish finder. And the humans followed the fish. Charter captains, anglers, and divers now steer for a patch of ocean whose coordinates exist because New York wore out its trains. One of the reef's managers summed up what divers see down there with a phrase that has stuck ever since. They call it the underwater train wreck. And the science kept receiving visitors too, because a field of identical steel boxes dropped on featureless sand is something researchers almost never get: a controlled experiment on the seafloor. University teams ran sonar surveys over the site year after year, mapping how the cars settled, how currents scoured the sand around them, how the seabed itself reorganized around the new architecture. The cars weren't just hosting life, they were changing the physical shape of the bottom, each one generating its own scour pits and sand ridges, its own micro-terrain, the way a boulder changes a river. And an important detail hides in that 400 times number. It wasn't measured overnight. Delaware's biologists tracked the reef as it matured, and the food supply climbed over roughly 7 years to reach that figure, which tells you something crucial about how these ecosystems work. An artificial reef isn't an event. It's a slow-motion construction project run by mussels, and the payoff compounds for decades. But if you want to understand why the subway program was engineering and not just dumping, you need to hear about the time the same idea went catastrophically wrong, because it did, and every reef manager in America knows the story. In the 1970s, off Fort Lauderdale, Florida, well-meaning organizers tried to build a reef out of the era's most abundant waste product: used car tires. Roughly 2 million of them were bundled and sunk across the seabed. It became one of the great environmental own goals of the century. Tires are light, and the bundles broke apart in storms. Loose tires rolled and scoured across the bottom for miles, smothering natural coral instead of nurturing new growth, washing up on beaches after hurricanes, and marine life largely refused to colonize the rubber at all. Decades later, crews including military divers were still hauling tires back out of the ocean, undoing the reef one piece at a time. That disaster is the shadow standing behind every subway car that went over the side, and it explains the obsessions of the program. Weight, so the structure stays where it's put. Steel, because marine life binds to it eagerly. Openings, so water and animals flow through instead of tearing the structure loose. The redbirds succeeded precisely where the tires failed, and the comparison is the proof that material and preparation, not good intentions, decide whether the ocean accepts your gift. But this story was never as tidy as the postcard version, and honesty requires the fight. When New York offered cars to New Jersey, environmental groups pushed back hard, and their objection was that word from earlier: asbestos. Not all of it can be stripped from a redbird. Some remains bonded within the car's materials. On land, in demolition, that's a serious airborne hazard. The reef scientists argued that underwater is a different world. The fibers that endanger lungs in dry air are bound in place and effectively unmeasurable in the sea, and studies of the sunken redbirds found no meaningful contamination. But the controversy was real, loud, and consequential. New Jersey held out, demanded studies, and imposed a years-long moratorium on subway car reefing, while states to the south happily took shipment after shipment. The final batches were only accepted after years of public argument. Reasonable people fought about this, and one piece of their caution turned out to be prophetic, just not in the way anyone expected. Because when the redbirds ran out, the program tried to continue with the next generation of retired cars, the stainless steel fleets, including the famous Breitliners, revolutionary in 1964, lighter and gleaming and rust-proof. On paper, stainless steel in seawater sounds ideal. New Jersey officials estimated the newer cars could last 25 to 35 years underwater. The ocean disagreed. Inspections reported in 2009 found significant structural damage in nearly every stainless car surveyed at the checked sites, some effectively collapsing after only a few years, while the carbon steel redbirds sitting nearby remained sturdy, encrusted, and fully occupied. The old heavyweights, built like tanks from thick, mild steel, were outliving the modern lightweights on the seabed, and further stainless deployments were halted while officials investigated. Sit with the engineering autopsy for a moment, because the failure is more interesting than it first sounds. The obvious suspect, rust, is exactly backwards. Stainless steel resists corrosion far better than the carbon steel of the redbirds. Chemistry wasn't the killer. Structure was. The redbirds were products of 1950s design philosophy. Massive frames, thick mild steel bodies, weight everywhere. The same brute force overbuilding we saw in an earlier video keep old locomotives alive for half a century. The Breitliner generation was a triumph of the opposite philosophy. Thin, corrugated stainless skin over a light frame, strength achieved through clever shaping rather than mass, perfect for accelerating quickly and sipping electricity. On land, that's simply better engineering. But the seafloor doesn't load a structure the way a subway line does. Down there, the enemy is the storm. Surge currents grabbing a 50-foot box like a sail, sand liquefying and shifting beneath it, cyclic pounding that flexes panels millions of times, in an environment where a thin skin, once cracked or peeled at a seam, unzips. The heavyweight redbirds absorbed all of it with sheer cross-section. The lightweights, optimized to the millimeter for a world of rails and schedules, met a world with no rails and no schedule, and folded. There's a second, quieter irony too. The very asbestos-era construction that made the redbirds an environmental controversy on land was part of a manufacturing culture: thick steel, overbuilt everything, that made them nearly immortal underwater. The materials fight that almost stopped the program, and the durability that made it a triumph, came from the same factory floor 60 years ago. There is an engineering parable in that. A design optimized for one environment, light, thin, corrosion-resistant in the rain, met an environment it was never designed for: crushing storm surge, shifting sand, relentless mechanical battering, and the crude old thickness of the redbirds turned out to be the feature that mattered. By 2010, with more than 2,500 cars deployed along the coast, the reefing era wound down. And one more honest note belongs here, because scientists still debate a real question about all artificial reefs: how much new life they truly produce versus simply concentrate from surrounding waters. The 400-fold food measurement argues that these steel boxes genuinely grow biomass rather than just gathering it. But a subway car on the sand is not a coral reef reborn, and no serious biologist claims it is. It is something more modest and still remarkable: shelter where there was none. So picture the scene as it exists tonight, 80 feet under the Atlantic. Rows of red-painted steel, the paint long surrendered to a living crust of mussels and sponge, sea bass drifting through door frames, a tautog holding position where a strap hanger once held a pole, tanks and tugboats standing in the dark like neighbors. Every one of those cars carried millions of people through a city that never noticed them. And now, worn out and thrown away, they are carrying life again, more of it than the empty sand ever could. We tend to think a machine's story ends when we stop using it. The redbirds are proof that sometimes the second career is longer than the first. The city retired them, the ocean hired them, and the trains that spent 40 years underground will spend their next century underwater, still crowded, still working. The commuters have gills now, but the cars never stopped taking passengers. If stories like this one change how you see the machines around you, hit subscribe, because the railroad's strangest chapters are the ones nobody tells, and we tell one every week. And in the comments, I want your verdict on the fight: brilliant recycling or dumping with good publicity. Pick a side and defend it. And click the video on screen for more of the hidden logic of the rails.